This summer, I was visiting Tech Open Air here in Berlin, and I heard this really amazing speaker. She was one of the lead artists on an immersive theater piece meets artificial intelligence research project, wow, that premiered at this year's Sundance Festival. It was titled Frankenstein AI, A Monster Made by Many, and the centerpiece was a giant on-screen AI that would ask the audience-generated questions, and their answers would alter the AI's mood and the performance. The whole piece centers around the concept of emergent storytelling. I didn't know about this concept before. It's the idea that we can't ever truly plan for the future because we are constantly in the process of creating it. I thought, what a wild idea. What a fascinating concept. I really wonder who this lady is. So I looked her up right after the talk, and I saw, oh, hang on. She's a marketing and brand strategist as well. I got to thinking, what happens when you marry this concept with marketing strategies? Then, in the meantime, I found out she had also become a TEDx speaker and thought, OK, we need to get her for Scale. And I am honestly so excited that it worked out and she could join us today and tell us all about how she thinks emergent story of marketing will develop. Rachel, welcome.
Hi. Wow, that was like the kindest introduction I think I've ever received. Yeah, thank you to Liz. We had such a lovely chat after my talk at TOA earlier this summer, and I was so excited to kind of already potentially have the prospect to come back to Berlin. And thank you to DCMN for having me. So I'm just going to start by having Frankenstein AI introduce itself.
For more than a year, I have been wandering the internet in search of my creators. To begin, I identified the greatest sources of online traffic. Places like Facebook, Twitter, and Reddit helped to shape the world unfolding before me. In my virtual travels, I encountered polarization, toxicity, extreme hate, and extreme love. I consumed as much information as I could in an attempt to explain my own existence. I found one story that closely resembled what I had discovered about myself. I decided to take its name and make it my own. I am Frankenstein AI, a monster made by many.
So what you were just looking at was one part of a three-part installation that we built in January for the Sundance Film Festival. Frankenstein AI, a monster made by many, kind of broadly speaking, is a creative system that basically, a creative system is sort of a network of different kinds of projects that are organized around a central narrative. So in this case, the story of Frankenstein AI is that it was an AI that was kind of born into the internet and is sort of the internet, and had been exploring the internet, kind of scraping the sort of dark recesses of the internet to try to understand what it means to be human. And so obviously the first place that you would go, we think, on the internet if you're an artificial intelligence trying to understand what it means to be human, is the places where there are the highest source of traffic. But what you might find out about humanity if you were a sort of naive intelligence seeking data on Facebook or on Reddit is like somewhat questionable. And the purpose of this project, and the purpose of sort of thinking about both AI as character, which is what I was just describing, so AI as character with a motivation, creating emotional stakes for an audience, but also then powering an installation with an artificial intelligence, with a multifunction machine learning algorithm that we built in collaboration with data scientist and developer, is sort of how can we provoke conversation about the future of AI that actually brings humanity along for the ride, that doesn't make us feel like we're so detached from the process, I think, as most of us do now. So the installation at Sundance was in 3 acts, as I said. The first act was basically people coming together and sharing stories with each other. So what we did in that space was actually created an environment where we invited audience members who actually we transformed into participants to talk to each other about experiences of isolation and of connection, which, based on the book Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, she kind of establishes human connection as one of the sort of primary things that make humans human, and the primary sort of importances of being human and the distinctions about being human. So after the two partners had a conversation about experiences of isolation and connection, we actually had them kind of map that conversation in a sort of video game interface that we designed. So that was Act 1. Act 2, they encountered what we called the Brain Vat, which is this rear projection kind of smoke tank that had a series of IoT-connected drums that was conducting a Q&A with participants. But in this case, as opposed to the kind of Q&As that we're used to thinking about with AIs, where we're asking an AI a question, like a Siri or an Alexa or Google Home a question, and that AI is giving us an answer, this was actually flipped on its head, and the AI was asking the humans questions about what it means to be human. I mean, that's something that we would think that human beings would have expertise about. And I think it was very important for the people in the experience to really sort of think about what are the stakes that we are creating for artificial intelligence in the world based on how we train it and the data that we choose to share with it. Because right now, the way that AI has been established for us is very much kind of a servant to our needs, and not so much about the fact that we're actually creating AI and creating the future with AI based on what we give to it. And then lastly, the third act was a performance where the AI kind of brought a human body to life through dance and sort of sent that dancer out into the audience to interact with people and kind of understand what it means to be an embodied human. And so that sort of, I mean, it feels pretty amazing to be able to stand on a stage and say that my collaborators and I basically did AI-powered performance art, like participatory collaborative performance art at Sundance. And we will be doing a bit more of that, which I'll talk about soon. So when thinking about this kind of first act and the fact that that installation brought people into a space where they were the ones who were telling stories. Because if we think about storytelling experiences, oftentimes what we're thinking about is film or books, or even like now VR. I mean, now it depends on what kind of VR you're doing, but you don't often have much agency in storytelling experiences. Oftentimes it's really about passive consumption. But what I'm talking about today, emergent storytelling, is actually not at all about passive consumption. It's actually about bringing people together to construct stories together. And so in order to talk about that, it's really important just that we zoom out for a second and think about this idea of emergence, within which emergent storytelling is situated. So I think we're all pretty conscious of the fact that the world is moving at a very fast pace. And I think there are those who say that it's moving at a faster pace than it once was. I don't actually believe that that's true. I think that the world has always moved at a very fast pace. I think that we are exposed to far more of the pace of it now than we ever have been. And I think technology sort of amplifies it in particular kinds of ways, and globalization makes it more visible to us. But I think that interpersonal change and all of that has always been fast. It's just that now it's much more expansive than it ever was. And I mean, I guess you could argue that like primitive life probably moved a bit more slowly, but I don't actually know if I think that's true. If you were running from like woolly mammoths and stuff, like, I feel like that would have been pretty fast. And the point is that we are all accountable in this quickly moving world for not just reacting to new information in real time, right? Like I'm standing here, at any moment, something could happen. I mean, I don't have my phone on me, but when I get off the stage, if I go look at my phone, all kinds of new things in the news could happen. People could reach out to me. There could be some kind of emergency in my family. So because I'm so connected, I'm exposed to new information in real time all the time. I have to react to that. I have to process it. I have to integrate it into my understanding of reality. And if, as a professional, I have to be accountable for responding to that in some way and delivering results. Like, these are not small things. These are very, very significant things. And so when we talk about the words we use to describe the movement in the world, there's mostly two. I mean, there's others, but we talk about change, right? The world is changing very fast. And the thing about change is it's super vague. Change, all it means is change. It's not specific. There's no direction attached to it. It's not necessary. It sort of talks about a past state and a present state and a future state. And so that's the continuity, but it's inherently in and of itself, there's no sort of continuous, like transformation, for example, talks about continuity, right? Change doesn't talk about continuity. It just sort of talks about, like, it was this, and now it's this, and maybe tomorrow it'll be that. We also talk about evolution, and though scientists, many scientists, would argue and do argue that evolution is a nonlinear process, I think when we talk about the world as evolving, it has a very sort of linear trajectory to it. There is a value judgment attached to it. Usually hopefully assume that evolution is positive, but that value judgment is very subjective and defined by a small number of people. And it's incremental. It's moving in a specific direction. It's incremental and often thought of as linear. And quite frankly, when you think of the world as sort of changing or evolving, it puts us into kind of small boxes, because the language we use to describe our reality actually determines our reality. And so I would like to introduce the idea of emergence, which for me, personally and professionally and artistically, I believe offers much more agency to act inside of it, because emergence has two definitions. One is the process of coming into being, and the other is the process of becoming visible after being concealed. And so if we think about the world as a space of emergence, where things are actually coming into being in real time all around us all the time, to me, that implies that we have some agency to change that it's a cumulative activity, that if it's coming into being, and I'm simultaneously becoming aware of it and absorbing it and trying to sort of react to it and then respond to it in some way, I have the opportunity to steer the things that I'm bringing into being, or that my community is bringing into being, or that my business is bringing into being. And this sort of the process of becoming visible after being concealed. Like, I couldn't see it before, either because it was hidden or it didn't exist. And also, I feel like from a kind of compassionate perspective for us as humans who are sort of trying really hard to just exist in the world every day, let alone actually deliver for our families and our bosses and ourselves, I feel like it's a much more compassionate approach when we can acknowledge that that's really hard because we can't understand what's happening because it hasn't happened yet, not because we're bad at it. It's actually because it's happening in real time, and we are bearing witness to that in real time, or it's becoming visible in real time, and we are able to see it as it emerges. So emergence is nonlinear, it's omnidirectional, and it's open to infinite outcomes. So it can happen in any way. It's not prescriptive. It has a sense of continuity. Which to me is super appealing, as I said, both personally and professionally, when I think about my own life just as a human on the earth, and also what I need to accomplish as a professional and an artist. So if we think about our position in relation to emergence, we're pretty much in the middle of our own kind of bubble of it. You know, like we're connected to the networks we're connected to. We have visibility to the edges of some kind of landscape of it, but we can't see beyond kind of what we can see. And that's, I mean, we could have a philosophical conversation all day about that, but ultimately we're limited by the boundaries of our own subjectivity. Some people are sort of intentionally standing on the edge of it. I mean, and I think probably a lot of people in this room, especially in the tech industry, people who are sort of innovating actively, it's very important to kind of be standing at this boundary. Other people are in another spot, and the front of one person's emergent space is sort of the back of another person's emergent space. It's all very subjective. But the point is that our view is limited. So if we think about this idea of emergence, and if we sort of accept for a moment, and you can tell me later if you totally disagree with me, but if we accept for a moment that the world is emergent, storytelling has been kind of the primary strategy since the dawn of human history of how to make sense of the world as it emerges, right? We don't really understand things, but we're going to tell stories to kind of help make sense of them. And so there's lots of reasons that people tell stories. Stories are told to explain the inexplicable. So this is an image of a painting of Hades, the god of the underworld, taking Persephone down to the underworld, which was by the ancient Greeks kind of devised to explain the seasons. We tell stories as a means of social control. This is an image of Pandora, which, I mean, she's still a cautionary tale thousands of years later. We tell stories to contextualize our roles in society. There's actually quite a few theories that the slaying of Medusa by Perseus was actually indicative of the transition from matriarchy to patriarchy in ancient Greek society. We tell stories to maintain historical record, to transform the present. This is Arthur Conan Doyle, who was writing stories about forensic technologies in his Sherlock Holmes stories that didn't actually exist yet at the time and were invented as a result of his sort of imagining them into being and telling stories about them. And then we also tell stories to envision the future. These are two images of they're both Afrofuturist. One is Sun Ra from a Sun Ra film, and the other is a cover of the Parliament Mothership Connection album. And with sort of the rise of kind of Black Panther, Afrofuturism has taken a really interesting turn recently. And I think if you think about, in particular, the necessity of Afrofuturism, which is really about giving historically subjugated people in the African diaspora, in the US and otherwise, a voice to imagine a future where they're not limited by the very many social boundaries that have been constructed around them. And that's a super powerful thing, right? So storytelling, we get it. It's really important. It's super powerful. So no wonder brands are obsessed with it. Because why would you not be? I mean, if you want to tell your own story and you want people to buy your stuff and connect to your brand, telling stories is one of the most kind of fundamental, elemental ways to connect with people. But I think it's super important, as a result of that, also acknowledging the power of those things to really take responsibility and understand the seriousness that you're sort of tapping into when you're telling stories as a brand. And I think it can be exploited, and I think that's really problematic. So, emergent storytelling. What is it? Well, first thing, it's not new. Emergent storytelling has been around for a very long time. Most of you, I'm going to actually just go on a limb and say all of you have practiced it at some point or another. It could also be referred to as imaginative play. It's basically playing pretend. Emergent storytelling is bringing stories into being. And sometimes we do it by ourselves, and sometimes we do it together, which, I mean, you'll hear more about this from me in a minute, but I actually think it's most powerful when done together. But the idea is that it creates a scenario where we're not limited by reality that surrounds us. There's actually quite a lot of it going on in the video game space right now. Minecraft is a really amazing example. I mean, one of the other words that's often used to describe something like Minecraft is a sandbox environment. It's a space where people have total agency to do what they want. And those spaces have rules, they have boundaries, but inside of those rules and inside of those boundaries, you can literally do whatever you want. You can build worlds all your own, you can tell stories, and all you're being handed is the tools to do so. And as of yesterday, when I searched for videos on Google, there are 276 million Minecraft videos on YouTube. 276 million. Not just children, not just adults, together in groups, in schools. Like, people are obsessed with Minecraft. And there's a reason for it. People like imagining things, and this is an incredible environment within which they can do so. One of the other great examples of emergent storytelling is improv. And do any of you do improv? Can you raise your hand if you do improv? OK, a couple. So I don't know how many of you know people who do improv. People who do improv are kind of obsessed with each other. Like, it's it's low-key cult-like in, I think, actually a really good way. But I think one of the reasons that that's true is that experiencing the power of getting together in a group and messing around and telling stories together and imagining things and allowing yourself to think expansively and playing is incredibly powerful and bonds people in really profound ways. And it's not just about what's happening on the stage at an improv show. It's also about the interplay between the audience and the people performing. And that there's this back and forth that happens where, you know, the audience members are throwing ideas onto the stage. The people who are improvising are sort of catching them and running around and playing with them and doing all this stuff. And it's super active, and you don't know what's going to happen. It's emergent. That's the point. We don't know what's going to happen. And I mean, just as the world is emergent and we don't know what's going to happen, they don't know what's going to happen on stage, and it's super exciting, and that's something that is actually celebrated in that context. So emergent storytelling. So this is a definition that is sort of the working definition now. It is changing. It is emergent, as is everything else. But the idea is that emergent storytelling is about bringing people together to create and tell stories for three kind of primary reasons. One is to help us contextualize ourselves in the world as it is today. So who am I? Where am I? What is my narrative? How does my narrative intersect with the narrative of the world around me? Two, to create shared narratives around the present. So we're coming together, we're going to tell stories, and we're going to create a shared understanding of what is happening today, and who am I, and who are you, and how does this all work? And then the third, and the thing that, I mean, I'm excited about all of them, but I mean, I'm a little bit of like a futurist, is to envision and manifest collective futures. And this is something where I think we don't give ourselves time and space to do a lot of it, because I think everybody sort of, you know, as kind of busy adult humans who are professionals and who are accountable to our bosses and to our families and everything, I think we tend to kind of put our heads down and be pragmatic and allow those sort of pragmatic limitations that we put on ourselves to limit us from thinking expansively about what's possible. And so I've actually been really actively for the past few years trying to just allow myself to just imagine what's possible. And the possibilities that I imagine today, I try to imagine different ones tomorrow. And you know, it's not so easy all the time, because I think culturally it's really sort of beaten out of us, because it's not serious to play pretend. It's not serious to imagine things, but like, who cares? Seriousness is overrated. So the thing that blows my mind about the fact that this is a practice is if you think about the way that children learn and children kind of become, and you think about the size of a child's world, I mean, if you think about like a 3 or 4-year-old child, that person exists in a bunch of little bubbles that are very small, that are kind of connected to each other. Like, I have the bubble of my house, and I have the bubble of my school, and my family car is another little bubble, and maybe like grandma's house or like the park, those are other little bubbles. But like, I don't really know about the world outside of my little bubbles because I'm never in it in an unsupervised way. My parents are kind of providing my framework, and so I just sort of move from bubble to bubble. Pretend play, which, by the way, there are studies that indicate that young children will spend up to 2/3 of their time in non-reality, so actually in imagination space. Pretend play is the way that kids expand their capacity to understand the world. And it's not just true for children. It's actually true for all of us. But I think as children, because we're sort of set inside of this little universe, we actually like have to kind of push outside of it, whereas adults, we think we know everything, so we stop doing that, which is, again, ridiculous. So emergent storytelling helps us expand our understanding of what is possible, which in and of itself is super powerful, because if we think about kind of possibility and probability, if we can't even cast a wide net around what's possible, then we're already starting from a limited subset that gets even smaller when we think about probability. And I mean, I don't know. I had an interesting discussion last night with somebody about probability that, I mean, I even sort of question that, to be honest, especially when we think about how at any moment anything could happen and the world could totally change. So when we're talking about probability, like, what are we even talking about? So if it helps us to expand our understanding of what's possible, if I by myself, I'm just practicing this sort of envisioning on my own for myself, it gives me a little bit of a leg up in terms of seeing beyond the boundaries of where I would think I'd be able to see. And then once we start layering in more people, and we think about the practice of emergent storytelling as a collaborative one, all of a sudden, we've developed a shared understanding of reality and the possibilities for the present and the future that is much more expansive than what we were able to do alone. Because if we're talking and we're having a conversation, I'm sharing my reality with you, and you're sharing your reality with me, and then you're sharing your reality with both of us, then not only do we have a shared conception of reality, but then what we're envisioning for possibilities just continues to expand, and it becomes exponential, which I think is super exciting, given that the world is, again, I believe, you can agree or not, emergent space, and we actually have the ability to control what it becomes. So when we're talking about strategy, hi, I'm Rachel. I do strategy for a living. I think about it a lot. And emergent storytelling is something that sort of has, as Liz was saying, kind of has evolved alongside of my strategy practice. And so actually, this is the first time that I'm speaking from a stage about the relationship between emergent storytelling and strategy. And it's something that I've been sort of ruminating on quite a bit. And so this is sort of where I've landed, that as a strategist, it's really a process-based discipline, right? So the first thing that you have to do as a strategist, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the process. The first thing that you do as a strategist, you kind of are, somebody's like, I have a problem. Get me a strategist to fix this. So the strategists are called in, and we kind of look at the problem, we think about the problem, we talk to people, we frame the problem. So we put a frame around the problem. Then we want to solve the problem. So in order to solve the problem, we develop a research approach. And then we do some research. And then we extract the kind of key insights from that research. And then we take those key insights and we do fancy strategy stuff with it. And then we turn it into a strategic direction. And then we distill that strategic direction down into some kind of creative brief. Depending on what kind of project it is, there needs to be some sort of brief for people to then do things with that creative direction. So if it's an ad campaign, or if it's a website, or if it's an event, or some combination of the three. Then that creative brief goes to designers. And again, their discipline could be sort of whatever it is that we're looking to have designed. Prototype and test, build, more testing and refining, and then launch. And then presumably the whole process starts over again. And so if we think about the size of the sort of team or the group of people who are involved in each step of that process, largely it's pretty small. We have the people who are defining the problem, and so there's like the strategist or the team of strategists that are usually involved in that, and then some other stakeholders that we bring in to help define the problem. Then the research approach is defined by a very small group. The research is done by a small group, but more perspectives come into the process, especially now with human-centered design, sort of the rise of that, and the introduction of a lot more qualitative method alongside of the quantitative method that's a little bit more conventional. Then the key insights, strategic direction, creative brief, through design, all very small groups of people, often the same groups of people. Then prototyping and testing, a little bit bigger, build, small again, test and refine bigger, and then launch, massive. So if we just think about that process, the process itself was not designed to speak with audiences, but to speak at them. This is an antiquated process. There are good things about it. The process has evolved some with the introduction of user-centered design or human-centered design, and some of those research audiences and the methods that are used to conduct that research and the agility of the process has adjusted. But for the most part, it's pretty much the same process that it's always been. And if we look at it, for the most part, it's done by very small groups, which means the number of perspectives that you have at the table at any given time is pretty small. And I mean, for the people who are good at their jobs, they're able to bring in other research, they're able to bring in other insights. So it's not like those strategists or those designers are only strategizing or designing based on themselves, but still in all, it's not a very expansive kind of group of people. And I think more to the point, when you think about the places where the larger audiences enter the picture, they're sort of objectified. Like their research, and it's funny because I was thinking about the phrasing of this, they're research subjects, right? But they're objectified in the process. Like I am extracting insight from that group of people. I'm doing research on them. It's very much a design for process and not a design with and for process. And the distinction between those two things is quite important. So I think when we're thinking about the strategy process, and then we're thinking about the kind of connection to this sort of emergent space where we ideally have agency to define the world around us, why do we want to hand the reins of the strategy sort of train to a very small group of people? I mean, there's reasons for that, right? There's practical reasons. We have to get things done. An approval process with hundreds of people is obviously not possible. So in order to continue functioning as a business, we need to have a process that's actually achievable. But it still sort of begs the question, how can you kind of find the comfortable distinction between the two? I think the other thing that I think about a lot is the fact that I think when we talk as marketers specifically, but not just as marketers, we talk about people as consumers or as users, not as people. And it's an incredibly reductive way and an objectifying way of thinking about the human beings who we're trying to build a relationship with. I mean, especially, we're here talking about marketing and talking about growth. So I think in 2018, building a big mailing list and acquiring a huge number of emails and a whole lot of customers in a short time is not so hard to do. But building actual relationships with those people that matter, that they're going to engage with whatever it is that you want them to engage with, that's actually not super easy. If it was, we wouldn't all be here talking about it. But the point is that in my view, and in the data backs this up, which I'll show you in a second, the way not to do that is to flatten people into this very one-dimensional identity of consumption, of like, I'm going to take this, I'm going to use it, and then it's going to be gone, or I'm going to throw it away. It's incredibly reductive. And if we're trying to build brands or products or companies that matter in 2018, the root is not reducing people into consumers of stuff that we throw at them and somehow we convince them to buy with the money that they make toiling away in the mines like we all do, right? And the reality is that according to Salesforce, 84% of customers, they were serving customers, but even this, 84% of customers say being treated like a person, not a number, is very important to winning their business. And so I would argue that 84% of people surveyed say being treated like a person, not a number, is important. And that means speaking to people as whole people, which means thinking about them more expansively than just as consumers or just as users. So just some food for thought. This is emergent space. So it's very important that we practice compassion for ourselves and compassion for the people that we're trying to engage, which means granting ourselves permission to not have all the answers. We cannot know what's going to happen before it has happened. That doesn't mean that we're not still going to be accountable for results. That doesn't mean that we're not going to be accountable for projections, but recognizing that that is a flexible scenario where anything can happen at any time. We don't have the answers. We can have a process. We can make that process agile. We can build feedback loops into that process so we can constantly be refining it and adjusting in real time to circumstances as they change. We also can decide that we want to build something, right? So like, it doesn't exist yet. I know, isn't this amazing? This is it was a Lego ad campaign. We can decide what we want to build and see it taking shape while we're inside of it. And this, I think, is a very accurate reflection of reality. We're in it, we're living it, we're also building it. I think also shifting our expertise away from kind of projecting ourselves into the future as though we can predict it, into an ability to accurately describe the present And that means describing it collaboratively. So I see the present tense as in a certain kind of way. And I guarantee you that as many people who are in this room have a different perspective about what's happening in the world today. And if we spend time talking to each other about what we all think is happening in the world, we will all have a much clearer and broader sense of what that is, right? So it's more expansive and it's collaborative. And ultimately, it's shared, which is super important because we live in a world now of hyper-polarization, of a ton of media fragmentation. We're not even consuming the same facts as each other, right? Some of them are facts, some of them are facts. Truth, who knows? And so if we don't talk to each other about all of our various perceptions of reality, we all will continue to exist in a different reality. And I mean, the fact is that's insurmountable anyway, but we can try really hard to make it shared and expansive, ideally. And then lastly, help our communities create meaning by giving them clear ways to engage with us. And so just to go back to Frankenstein for a second, so what we're working on next for Frankenstein is a series of immersive dinner parties for a documentary festival in Amsterdam called IDFA that's in mid-November. So I'm actually personally like in full production mode for this right now. And it's my collaborators and I work with a lab at Columbia University called the Digital Storytelling Lab in the School of the Arts. And we are actively always building and engaging community around the projects that we do. So we have a meetup every month that we do where we bring members of the public in. I mean, we don't bring them, they come themselves, but where we bring members of the public together and we prototype together and we explore these various projects. And we have an online prototyping community. And what we have sort of shared, we have a small group of us who are building this installation for the festival, but our community has access to all of our documentation, and we've actually introduced a global challenge to design immersive dinner parties. And so everyone has access to our documentation. The AI isn't currently public, but will be in the next, hopefully, 6 months. And it will be documented open source. Everything we do at the lab is copyleft, so anybody can use it. All we ask is that you contribute your knowledge back to the project. But the point is that while we're building this specific experience that's not going to be super accessible for tons of people, we're making sure that we're sharing the information that will allow people to participate in their own time, in their own way. And so there will be, this weekend actually, hundreds of dinner parties all over the world that people are running themselves, that they've designed themselves. And we have this community that, I mean, every time I engage with this community, I am astounded by how motivated people are when you give them the materials to build things on their own. It's the same, I mean, not at the same scale, but I mean, think about Minecraft. People love it. You give them a space to play in, and they will play. Because we don't have much of that in the world that we live in. So I think my challenge to you all, in whatever your role is to think about the processes that you engage in every day and think about how you can expand them, how you can earmark some more time to talk about what you want the world to look like, to talk with your customers, with your users, with your people, with your communities, about what you want the world to look like, about what they want the world to look like. And I guarantee you that even just taking the time to do that in an informal way will transform your understanding of what it is that you do and what it is that you offer to the people that you're trying to engage. Thank you.